Welcome to another episode of Keep Arizona Wild. I am your host, Clint Culberson, coming to you live from the sunny deserts of Arizona. And I'm joined also by a lady who is just down the street from me, actually, even though we're communicating via Zoom audio, or video conferencing. Joanna Allhands. She's the digital opinions editor for the Arizona Republic. Joanna, how are you today?
Hey, I'm doing good. How are you?
Oh man, beautiful day. We just had that rain a couple days ago, and it just feels like the air is as fresh as could be. So it's a
It's
good. This
nice.
is why we live here in the Sonoran Desert. Is times
That's
like
right.
this. Joanna, I wanted to have you on because you recently wrote an article that was titled "The Four Things Arizona Should Learn from California's Groundwater Regulation Fight." We were talking before we came on here, but just about how pressing of an issue the water issue is here in Arizona. I mean, really the whole world. It's probably the number one issue for the world, but especially in places like here in the Sonoran Desert, where when expansion came out west, when there was less people, it was just kind of eat, drink, and be merry, because there was so much of everything really. And now, as time has gone forth, populations have just been explosive, especially out in the western cities and western metropolises of the country. Now we're really starting to see that we're having some major issues in terms of sustainability with the current usage of groundwater pumping. And we'll talk specifically here for Arizona, but I'd really like you to just kind of get into, uh, I want you to actually talk about this Groundwater Management Act that the Arizona passed 40 years ago, and just how it relates even to, even your article, how it compares to what California did, and where we're going from here. But go
Sure,
ahead.
sure. The big thing to know about the Groundwater Management Act of 1980 is that if we did not have this act, Arizona would not be what it is today. I mean, it really is that kind of like seminal sort of legislation for Arizona. It changed everything, and really the reason that it came about in 1980 was we were having this exact problem, but more in the urban areas of, especially Pinal County. There were areas in Phoenix where we were pumping tons of groundwater completely unsustainably. The ground was, falling out from underneath. Water tables were dropping really rapidly. And so, there was this coalition of people in 1980 who got together and said, we got to do something about this. I mean, it's really serious. And so the way that the Groundwater Management Act works, and I won't get too in the weeds of this because I don't want people to be like, meh,
Mm.
but basically, uh, it sets up these areas called active management areas. And so Phoenix is in one, the Phoenix metro area is in one, there's one in Tucson, Prescott. Um, and so these areas, and Pinal has one also, but it has kind of a little different situation there. And so basically, they're areas that set up a lot more rules for groundwater pumping and sustainability. There are regular plans that we have to go through, management plans, to help sort of. The idea was to sort of over time ratchet up kind of the regulations, to make sure that we get to something called safe yield. And tell me if I'm getting way too in the
No,
weeds
no,
here.
no. This is great.
So safe yield basically means, well, it's a good question what safe yield means, because actually there's some state committees that are working on this right now to try to figure out what did we actually mean when we said safe yield 40 years ago. But the general idea was that if you are taking out groundwater, you are replenishing an equal amount. So, and over time, this is supposed to happen. So it's not necessarily like, if you pump, you know, 5,000 acre feet more water out than in on, 1 year, you're suddenly out of safe field. That doesn't necessarily mean safe field. But it's basically just sort of over time that we're finding this balance of we're putting water back in the ground and into the aquifer that we're taking out. So that's kind of the idea, is that we wanted to, over 40 years, kind of get to this point of safe yield. Except for in Pinal County, it's a different story. They do not have safe yield as a management goal. And so I don't know if you've sort of seen things about sort of what's happening in Pinal County now, just with the amount of unmet need that the state has found in Pinal County. They have some somewhat different issues than what you're going to see, in the Phoenix AMA versus, Prescott or Tucson or whatnot. So they have something a little bit different. But anyway, so that's the goal. That's basically kind of the overarching deal of what the Groundwater Management Act did. Now, the great trade-off that happened with the Groundwater Management Act is that in order to get it passed, they basically had to give the rural areas of Arizona a pass and said, you know what, we're not going to put you in an AMA. You can basically continue to pump groundwater as you'd like under your rights, and we're not going to try to rein in how much you're using. And so that has kind of come back to bite us in some of the rural areas where now over time the water tables are really starting to drop, and we're starting to see some real serious issues, in like Wilcox area where people's wells are starting to go dry. People have gone down, 1,000 feet for water, that sort of thing. It's getting super expensive to be able to have water in those areas. In La Paz County, there's a lot of agriculture that's pumping. Same thing in Mojave, there's agriculture that's coming over, that's popping up in areas that never had agriculture before. And we know farming is the largest water user. It takes an inordinate amount of water to maintain the evapotranspiration of plants. It's just, it is what it is.
Yep.
But there's a lot of water use that's happening. We don't have a really good handle in some areas on who's using the water, how much is being used, how much is left. Some areas we do have better handles on it, or at least have general ideas. So like in Mojave County, for example, there was recently a study that was finished that found, basically they're going to start hitting some real depth problems in like 60 to 70 years if things don't go on. And in water planning time, like they work in like decades of time. So 60 to 70 years is not really very long. So things need to happen. And we're sort of seeing this in a lot of areas, rural areas around the state, is that it's becoming increasingly clear that something needs to change, that we need to get a better grasp on this, because what we know about groundwater is that it's a one-time thing, basically. I mean, we can put groundwater back to sustain it. But the thing is that groundwater, the sediments that groundwater in, it's basically like a giant sponge, or maybe like a balloon, you could sort of say. And when you suck out the water from those sediments, they don't reinflate. So as you're pulling out that water, it's pretty much like you're shrinking the size of the aquifer for future use if you're not putting water back in to take the water that you're taking out. So there's some real issues, in Wilcox. There was a state study that found that, they have permanently shrunk the size of the aquifer. So it's not something, this is water that has collected over millennia, this is dinosaur water, basically that we're using at this point, and we'll never get that back. It's not a sustainable resource in terms of something that we can just pump and pump and pump and hope that like we'll get a couple of really good rains and it's going to fix it. That's not how it works. That was a lot.
Yeah, no, it's awesome. I mean, this is a humongous topic, and honestly, I find that 99% of Arizonans are almost illiterate when it comes to this topic. So this is, and it's me semi included. Okay, I'm only like Johnny come lately to this, and I'm learning. And that's why I want to talk to people like you who've been in the weeds a bit longer than I have for sure, and that's why I want to talk to you about it. How much of an impact, let's talk about that Southern Arizona issue. How much of an impact, though, has this influx of corporate farms that have come in, bought up a lot of the smaller farms, and kind of put them all together, and now these guys are they got these humongous operations, whether that be, field farming or even livestock as a water use. How much of an impact are they having in increasing the consumption rates of water down there?
Yeah, I think, clearly there is definitely concern about what's happening there. And I think what you hear a lot is that, it's actually kind of difficult to know. I mean, we know, that some of the larger farmers down there in the Wilcox area, they have much deeper pockets and can afford to sink, six figures into a very deep well, and are, starting to pump, um, you know, they're pumping lower and are dropping the water table beyond where a lot of residential wells are.
Mm-hmm.
So people are their wells are starting to grow dry, and people are, starting to really worry about the sustainability there. Is it only agriculture there? um, I would say it's probably a good part of it. But there's a lot more, I think, of study that we could use to help inform the debate.
Yeah. Now, take places like Pinell County, where there's a lot of residential development. How long into the future do developers have to kind of ensure that, hey, we're going to put this out here, but there's enough water for X amount of years to sustain this? Do you
Right.
know about that?
So, well, yeah, and so that gets complicated. So, as part of the Groundwater Management Act, so actually all places in the state have to say, like, all developers, when they're developing a property, they have to disclose whether or not they have a 100-year water supply. Outside of the AMAs, outside of the active management areas, it's the rules are a little bit different. It's an adequate water supply versus an assured water supply. There's just more stringent rules in the AMAs for that. Outside of the AMAs, you only have to say, like, hey, we don't have enough. Like, you just basically have to disclose it, but you could still build, if you don't have enough water outside of the AMAs. Inside the AMAs, so Pinell County is in an AMA. So there you have to have an assured water supply. And so this is where things get kind of complicated and sort of make it easy for the eyes to glaze over. But so I'll try to make this as simple as possible. So the Department of Water Resources, the state sort of agency that, does water stuff, they have a policy where you can get a analysis of adequate water supply, or assured water supply. Sorry. And so the analysis, it's kind of a thing that sort of like gets you in the door, sort of, to be able to start developing things. You need that, but in order to like get the final plats and everything, you have to have a certificate of water supply.
Mm-hmm.
And so right now the issue is there's a lot of places in Pinell County that have either analyses or don't have analyses, but are trying to get analyses. And because the state found that there is such a large amount of unmet need there, which basically means like over 100 years, there is not enough water to meet all of the needs in this model, which people have issues with the model and all the assumptions. That notwithstanding, there's still a lot. It's like 8 million acre feet, which is a lot. It's a decent amount of water. So anyway, that's the issue in Pinell County, is that there are developers who want to move forward, but either cannot get the final certificates, or are, maybe they're trying to develop something that on the books when it was initially developed, may have been projected to use more water, but maybe now they want to move it forward where it has less water use, maybe by like they want to take out a golf course or something like that, and put in houses that require less water, or whatever those things are. That basically they're trying to figure out what are the ways that we can continue to grow, because there's such a demand for growth in that area. given the fact that there is also this giant unmet need that they're going to have to figure out, how do we do that? How do we make sure that
Hmm.
we're putting stuff in that can sustain itself?
Oh yeah, yeah. I can only imagine. Uh, can you talk about who is in control of the water usage and how much pressure are those people under by developers to keep it going,
So do you
keep the
mean
pumps pumping?
like in Pinal County for development, or what do you mean?
Can you talk about just from a state level down to a county level? Who how is the water managed, and then how much pressure are those water managers under from development? Whether that be agricultural development, residential development, commercial development, industrial, the whole deal.
Yeah, well, so agriculture has they're grandfathered in, so they are able to um, continue ground continue farming, continue using groundwater because they have that right.
But
In
is there
AMAs,
anyone at a state level that can change that? I mean,
well, the legislature
yeah?
could do something, but there's really not any sort of
There's no
interest.
momentum towards that.
I don't think so. No. And I think what you're seeing now is, if you look down at the legislature, so there have been some proposals this year to mandate some kind of, at least metering, so that people know how much these large well users, how much water they're using. And so, and this is outside of the AMAs. So,
Mhm.
and I should make that distinction. There's differences
Yeah.
between
Hmm.
what happens inside the AMAs versus what's happening outside the AMAs. And so, there have been some bills to require some level of reporting of how much water the larger well users, which is a lot of agriculture and that sort of thing. It's wells that pump more than 35 gallons a minute. So not domestic wells, not wells like, you have like 5 acres in a well for
Hmm.
your house. Like, that's generally not what we're talking about here.
Hmm.
It's more the larger wells. So there have been various proposals. There's a bunch of different bills. Honestly, I think they're pretty much not going to go anywhere, even though it's interesting. And I think it's heartening to see the interest, and people do see, like, we've got to get better data. We've got to get a better understanding of what's happening and how much water we have left.
Hmm.
But there is just real fear on a lot of people's parts outside of the AMAs that this is going to lead to, if you start saying how much we use, it's going to start leading to, well, you can't use as much. And that's just, it's politically
Mm.
not going to happen. It's just not.
Oh, well, until there's nothing left. I mean, it seems like you got somebody's got to face it. I mean, forget the politics aside. Isn't it even in the farmer's interest, own self-interest, to make sure that they have a
Oh, sure.
sustainable business model that can
Sure.
go on for the future? Or is this kind of these are out-of-state corporations that come in here, they just bleed the land, and then they're hasta luego after the chaos happens?
Yeah,
Is
and
this
I
kind
think
of
it's
like
there's
that?
two different kinds of, I mean, agriculture, I think, often wants to get, people want to paint agriculture with a broad brush.
Right.
And I don't think that it's all that. I mean, there are still, the family farmers who have been
Yeah.
around and doing this for, dozens of, or, multiple generations, whatever, they've been farming. They do have deep roots and deep interests in the land. I think a lot of what it has to do with is that there's very much this distrust between rural Arizona and what we, as big fancy pants people in
Yeah.
Phoenix,
City slickers.
want to do that.
Easy for
When
us
it's
to
things
say.
that,
Here in
yeah, when
Gilbert.
it's something where people feel like it's being imposed
Yeah.
on them,
Mm-hmm.
there's a real distrust of that. And especially just the whole rural urban,
Oh yeah.
fight that's been going on for a very, very long time.
Oh yeah.
That's why, there are some bills and there is some effort to try to get the rural areas really invested in this process, and to understand that, like, this really does, affect you, and like, it is in your best
Mm-hmm.
interest. to make sure that we're sustainable. Um, so there are committees that are studying things. There are, there's a bill in the legislature right now that would create sort of this new classification for rural areas that would help them create some more sustainability goals. Um, you know, it's just, I think one of the things is when you talk about metering, it's one of those things where it's the political, like, just automatic reaction, like, no, even if when you kind of step back and go, it really would make sense. It's one of those things where it's sort of this third rail. And I think really in order for people to become more interested in that sort of approach, it's going to have to come from those rural areas that say, you know what, this is in our best interest to figure out how much water we're using and how much we got left.
So, as we come back to this idea of who is in control, and you've well explained, in terms of those areas, of these AMA areas, which in your article you talk about how 80% of Arizonans live within the AMA areas. Maricopa
Yes.
County, Pima County, Tucson, Phoenix. These are the main hubs of populations, and those are controlled at a county level, correct?
The water is controlled? No.
No.
So actually, Arizona has a pretty much top down kind of system.
Okay.
Where the Arizona Department of Water Resources largely holds a lot of the cards.
Okay, gotcha.
On water. And so honestly, I mean, that's kind of the difference. And, we kind of talk about that, the differences between Arizona and California. That is the difference, is that, in 1980, when this was created, honestly, I mean, there's people who have said now, like, in the political climate that we are in now, if the Groundwater Management Act of 1980 came up today, would it have actually been able to get across the finish line? Because things are so different here. Would we now be willing to do sort of this top-down thing that we did? It's a good thing. It served us well. The Groundwater Management Act, if we didn't have it, like I said at the beginning, we would not be here. It has allowed us to grow and, sustain the life that we know to this point. The question is, how do we move it forward? So yeah, a lot of the stuff that happens in Arizona is very top down, controlled sort of by this water agency, this central water agency. It's different in California. California is very decentralized, and honestly, depending on who you talk to, it sounds like it's probably that way on purpose. So that there's a lot of it's a lot of herding cats. I don't know how California is going to do things. And I guess I didn't actually explain that at the beginning. For people who probably haven't read the article, California has not had groundwater regulations until 2014 is basically when they finally got what they have now and are starting to move toward. So they have got some massive deficits that they have to walk their way out of. Whereas we in Arizona, we started, really 40 years ago. We've got 40 years under our belts of at least doing something, in urban areas. We haven't been completely unawares. But I think that is a good lesson for us to take from California, is like, when you have a problem, don't look the other way. Don't not do anything and be like, oh yeah, well, that's going to be really hard. So let's just not. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose the fear is, are we going to have ghost towns throughout the Southwest in 100 years from now? And that's what kind of the scary premise, and just total degradation of land. Like you said, balloons that can't be inflated again, ruined ancient aquifers that, that, like you said, it's like we're drinking dinosaur pee. Okay. I mean, this took a long time to fill up, and it ain't just going to fill back up overnight. And in some places it's kind of too late. And
I think that's kind of the big question. That's the $100 million thing that we're going to have to figure out over time. Is that really the way that we've largely done things is we realized that we were really, really, reliant on groundwater up until about 1980. And so, we spent an inordinate amount of money to create the Central Arizona Project, which brings the Colorado River water through the canals and stuff. That has been a huge thing, having the SRP system, Salt River Project. And so all of those reservoirs and water gives us a renewable supply, for Central Arizona, basically, are, the ones that benefit from that. And most of the older cities in the Phoenix area, Buckeye ain't got that water. They're growing, and they're growing largely reliant on groundwater. So there's issues there. But back to the whole thing, the way that we sort of did things is we said, okay, well, we're not going to use the groundwater as much in the AMAs, like in the Phoenix metro area, especially. We're not going to use groundwater as much. We're going to use these reliable sources, or these renewable sources, from SRP, CAP. Well, as the Colorado River water is dwindling, we're not getting as much of that renewable supply anymore. So what do we do when there aren't as many renewable supplies as there used to be? Everybody's like, oh, well, we'll get tribal leases for water. Well, those are only going to go so far, and that's not going to be a solution at all. There's going to have to be some sort of augmentation. We're going to have to augment the water supply we have with other sources. And I think conservation is important. And I think that's really the thing we got to do first. And that's one of the things that California hasn't done first in some areas, like San Diego. They just went all in on really expensive augmentation programs.
When you say
without
augmentation,
really doing the hard work of so how do you actually use less use less water?
Augmentation. When you say augmentation, you mean what? Digging deeper?
No. So augmentation, and sorry, I guess I should have.
That's okay. That's why I'm here.
That. So augmentation is basically finding additional water. It could be, I guess it could be digging deeper, but you can't go so deep. You know what I mean? There are some places where you can dig super deep, but like in the Phoenix metro area, for example, you really can't go super deep into the aquifer, because once you get into that really, really deep water of the aquifer, it starts getting really contaminated with arsenic and heavy metals and all the kind of stuff that just sinks because it's heavy, right?
Yep.
And that means not only does sinking wells cost more, but treating that water to get it usable for people is going to cost a lot more. It would just become cost prohibitive. That doesn't mean that people are starting to talk about that now. Maybe we dig deeper and that's how we augment. Some people are talking about so this takes a little bit of explanation. So there's this area called the Harquahala Valley that is an irrigation non-expansion area. And so basically it's an area where you can't really grow additional farming. And so there's this idea that maybe we'll just mine all the water from Harquahala and somehow stick it in the canal, the CAP canal, and move that water into central Arizona. It would require there's a lot of work that would have to do to have that happen. But even still, that's not going to be a sustainable thing. Really, when people talk about augmentation, mostly what they're talking about is desalination, water recycling, that kind of thing, stormwater recapture and reuse, really finding things that would be renewable supplies that we'd have to, treat.
Do you think?
But that stuff's expensive.
Yeah. Do you think that, if just put on our science minds, forget politics, all that stuff. If it's just a matter of how do you sustain a large amount of people in a place with a finite resource, do you think it's a matter of eventually getting to the point where, hey, you're not allowed to grow cotton in Arizona anymore because it's too high of a water usage plant? I mean, is it going to get to those kind of? Are those the kind of decisions that we need to make where, hey, if you still want to have increased population growth in these places, we also have to change the way we're doing things? And of
Yeah.
course, I mean, if there's any cotton farmers listening to this, they're probably swearing at us and telling me to, F off and all that. I get it. I understand. I mean, we're talking about people's livelihoods, family traditions, the whole deal. So I get it's very
Right.
like
Well, and there's
emotionally.
a reason that we grow cotton in Arizona, and that's because it's actually we're really good at it. We
Yeah.
grow cotton with less water than any other place in the world.
Hmm.
We actually get more yield than any other place that grows cotton. We do it better. Our alfalfa yields are actually really high too. And I
Hmm.
think when you hear people, from the agriculture industry, when you talk about it, I mean, there are a lot of things that they are doing. It's just the sheer fact that the amount of evapotranspiration that has to occur to keep that plant alive requires a lot of water. And so, yeah, this gets into that whole debate of what are the proper uses for water, who is allowed to use water. And there are definitely, a lot of people with a lot of strong opinions about that.
Mm-hmm.
You hear the farmers that are like, well, if you just stop growing, houses, we're part of the economy too, we matter. You hear the home builders saying, well, but yeah, but we use a lot less water than agriculture. Then you have people saying, well, there's industry, and industry is important. I mean, there's all these important
Oh yeah.
you
Yeah.
know uses, and how do you balance them? How do you say that one is more important than the other?
Mm-hmm.
That is going to be, I really think that's going to be the defining debate of the state probably over the next 20 years, is trying to figure out what are the acceptable uses, or
Mm-hmm.
the real uses, the good uses of water. I do think that farming does get maligned unfairly.
Mm-hmm.
I think that they have done a lot. And yeah, I know, because it's bad. You see these huge multinational corporations coming in and sucking out all this water. I mean, they argue, well, yeah, but look at us. We've got drip irrigation. We're putting in, all the stuff that's
Yeah.
top of the line, low water use kind of thing. So
Mm-hmm.
how do you weigh through all
I
of
know. I
that and
know.
make policy?
Yeah,
Um,
don't want to like try to paint anyone as the dark bad guy who's just
yeah,
drinking all the water and saying forget you guys, I'm keeping it all to myself. I mean, I assume that people are operating with the best interest at hand, and also we're in this like economic cycle of the farmer's got to pay his bills too, just like everybody. So
right,
he or she's got to keep the machine rolling themselves, and it's not so easy to just make huge drastic changes and also
right.
pay the
And
bills at
we're
the same
seeing that.
time.
There is some experimentation that's happening with some lower water use crops, and I think if they do pan out, probably the infrastructure will show up. I mean, the reason
Mm-hmm.
that we still have alfalfa and, cotton are our major crops is because there's a huge, in addition to the fact that, we're really good at growing
Mm-hmm.
it, we also have the infrastructure to do that, to
Yeah.
switch over to some other crop. It takes a whole
Oh yeah.
slew of things that
Mm-hmm.
it's not so easy for people to just, snap your fingers and do it right away. Because this stuff costs tens of thousands of dollars, and there is no money in farming these days. You
Yeah.
either got to be a huge farmer to make money, or you got to be really um, specialized in what you grow.
Mm-hmm.
That's the only ways that you can really survive in this game anymore.
Yeah.
But so there has been experimentation. People are starting to look at things like wayule, and there's this whole idea with growing hemp. I'm skeptical of the hemp. It's I don't think we're going to be able to stay under the THC values that state law requires.
Mm.
I don't know that it's going to work. But there are a lot of experiments, and they're really early. But I think that there are people really looking into this stuff and are trying to find some better ways to do things. I think one thing that's really interesting. So we just finished up the drought contingency plan, and so that doesn't have anything to do with groundwater. Well, sort of tangentially has things to do with groundwater.
Mm-hmm.
It's more Colorado River water and how we dealt with that whole situation of
Mm-hmm.
falling reservoir levels and that sort of thing. It's just a Band-Aid. But what's good about that whole process is it brought a ton of different interests together, people who did not work previously together. So you've got farmers working with developers, working with, you know, home build, or well, I said home builders, but you know, like cities and, you know, people who, tribes, people who typically in the past had been against each other, or at least just definitely not working in concert. And even after that process, when they finished up the DCP plan, these groups have continued to work together. And you've got groups like, the Environmental Defense Fund. I love them.
Mm.
I love their approach to things, because they're very much like, how do we get what's beneficial for us, but also what's beneficial for you? How do we make compromises to find things? How do we get things to work?
Mm-hmm.
And so all of these groups have started working together to try to, they've actually put in a bunch of different money, to try to do some more research into how do we find more sustainable agriculture for people that, you know, would be beneficial for them, so they can still continue their way of life. We can still have an economic, you know, part from this, like that
Mm-hmm.
we're not just going to cut ag off at the knees.
Yeah.
But you know, that can be more sustainable. And so I'm really interested to see those kind of partnerships and see where those go.
Beautiful. I was going to ask you, what's the good news? You know, I mean, and that seems you shared a tidbit of a good news that's happening.
Yeah, there is. Honestly, I am pleasantly surprised. Surprise isn't the right word. I'm heartened by sort of what I've seen so far. And I think really, you know, the whole drought contingency plan, which we call it DCP, the whole DCP process, I think was so important for the state with water, because it showed everybody that even if you have different ideas about who's the good person that gets the water,
Mm-hmm.
you know, we all have different ideas about who deserves water. You know, even though we all have these very different ideas, there's a very large truck going by. Sorry about that.
Oh, it's okay.
Even though we have these very different ideas about that you can work together, that you can find things that are going to be, you know, acceptable for both sides, that people can compromise and find, you know, solutions. And I think that has carried over. It's not, because DCP doesn't really like solve any problems. It just gives us a band-aid. But what it
Mm-hmm.
did do is that it gave us the working relationships that we need to
Mm.
be able to do the hard work and have the conversations where they can get, you know, in a room and, you know, light their hair on fire, you know,
Yeah.
who knows? But
Do you think though that it sets the stage for whatever the next stage is, the step is, that it will be something more sustainable, less of a band-aid, less of, hey, pulling it from here and there and that.
yeah,
It's, you know, just shuffling the shells, that we can actually get down to, holy cow, we can actually reduce consumption and replenish
yeah.
resources.
Yeah, I think DCP points the way toward that, even though, you know, it really doesn't. DCP only gives us basically 7 years, you know, of stuff with the Colorado River. And there's going to be unintended consequences that come with that plan. But what it did is it created the working relationships we need, so people can get into rooms and talk to each other and really hash out this stuff and have these really difficult conversations.
Mm-hmm.
And so far, with the stuff that's been happening with groundwater, the different committees that are meeting, both the local committees, like there's one that's meeting in Pinal County, it's a stakeholder group that's meeting. There's, you know, there's the governor's councils, there's a whole bunch of different
Mm-hmm.
subgroups that are working there. When you listen in on the conversations, and I've been to most of these meetings or listened to them, you know, people are talking, things are on the table. It's not like people are just like, well, let's just deal with that later, let's not talk about that. You know, it's like, no, let's get the stuff out here. Let's talk about what we really need to do. What are the things that we need to address? How do we make sure that we're actually solving these problems for the long haul?
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm heartened by that. It's still early in the process. We haven't gotten to the solution part yet. You know, but the way that we're going, there are so many people at the table, and people who need to be at the table are at the table.
Nice.
So that's the good thing. I think that's the good news, is that the right people are there. And I do think that people are increasingly, they care, they understand that this is an issue, that we can't look the other way on it, you know. And I
Mm-hmm.
really think, you know, we have probably, I think, probably a 1 to 2 year window where we
Mm.
can really deal with this, you know, where we can take the time to try to get the data that we need to, you know, really have these tough conversations and really start talking about how do we deal with this? How do we make our groundwater use more sustainable for the future? You know, I think we've got a 1 to 2 year window. I say that for a couple of reasons.
Yeah, I want to. That's
One is because so DCP is in effect for 7 years, but
drought contingency plan for
the
those listening.
drought contingency plan, but there's going to be what's called a reconsultation of basically the whole mamma jamma of the rules and everything that govern the
Mm-hmm.
Colorado River. Um, those will be opened up at the end of this year, and there will be this process that moves forward with that, which is expected to be probably even more crazy and time consuming and contentious
Mm.
than DCP. And so, you know, it took us 3 years to get DCP.
Mm.
And because of the way things were with staffing and whatnot and resources, it basically just, that's all ADWR did, was we worked on DCP, and everything else fell off. Um, I think we have a window right now where before all of that starts happening, we've got some time where we can really, you know, have these really good faith conversations. The challenge is, and that was kind of the thing that I wanted to um, point out in the piece about what was sort of different between us and California, is California, after several years, basically they just fought over a bunch of details of how to like measure their water use.
Mm-hmm.
And there's really not been a lot of solutions. They haven't really spent a lot of time in saying, so knowing all of this of how big a hole we're in, how are we actually going to get out of it?
Mm-hmm.
That's going to be the challenge for Arizona, is that we can translate what we have, knowing what we know, at some point to say, you know what? So what do we do about it?
Nice.
And I think there are lots of ideas out there. There are things that are percolating. I don't think that we're not to that point yet,
Good
but
word.
that's going to be the big thing, is that we have to get to that point of where
Mm-hmm.
we have solutions that we can start putting on the table and letting people say yay or nay.
On a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being really strong, how optimistic are you that Arizona will come up with a sustainability plan in the next, let's say, the next 20 years that will put us on a map of, you know, more than 100 years of sustainability?
Oh,
How
over
you,
20 years? I would say I'm at a 9. I
really?
think yeah,
Before
I'm pretty.
this is before catastrophe happens. Meaning, are we going to come up with this before it gets real ugly and we create even more, you know, irreversible damage?
Yeah, well, in that case, before you get the huge catastrophe, I would say probably 6.
You think it's got to hurt a little more?
Uh-huh. Yeah, well, because I mean that's the fact.
Yeah.
You know, water is super cheap in Arizona.
Mm-hmm.
You know, even for us being a desert state, we pay so much less than so
Yep.
many other parts of the country
Mm-hmm.
for water. And I think that's a testament to the fact that we actually did a pretty good job of figuring out water, you
Yeah.
know,
It's awesome.
in the early days. But you know what? Water is going to have to start really, it's going to get more expensive. There's no way
Mm-hmm.
around it. Water will become more expensive in Arizona. And I think you're going to have some of that. I mean, some people's wells are already starting to go dry, and
Mm-hmm.
people are still sort of saying, well, but you know, we can't really do anything. I think there's going to have to be some more like, holy crap, you know,
Mm-hmm.
this is about to hit the fan. We really have got to figure it out. I think Mojave County is really getting there, because they're realizing, like, you know, we really don't have a lot of cushion to be able to do this.
Yep.
We're going to have to figure this out. And so I think you're seeing more solutions coming out of that area because of that.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's probably what you're going to have to see in other places. And water will just have to become more expensive.
Yep.
I think some of the places where things are really going to hit the fan, I mean, we're already starting to see it a little bit in Pinal County. I think the Buckeye area and a lot of areas in the West Valley are less sustainable
Hmm.
than some of the cities that, you know, like Phoenix and Scottsdale and, you know, Mesa and,
Hmm.
you know, that sort of thing. I mean, the more historic cities of the valley are in much better shape. The newer ones, the ones that don't have the depth of water portfolio, you know, that they're really heavily reliant on like groundwater,
Hmm.
things are going to start hitting the fan. You know, the way that development has been financed, I don't think a lot of people realize that the cost to pay for the water that they need to replenish what they had to be able to build in the first place, um, that's all rolled into your mortgage, and the developer ain't paying that. It's the homeowner. The
Yeah.
homeowner is gonna, and as water gets more expensive and sources to replenish those obligations get more expensive and harder to find, people's mortgages are gonna, they have already gone up, they're gonna continue to go up. And I think that's gonna be the next one where we really start, I think that's gonna be the next, like, oh boy, we really got to do something
Oh
thing.
yeah. Oh yeah. That's why
So,
I personally, I own an irrigation business, and I've just recently got into the rainwater harvesting aspect of it, you know, and
oh
it's,
cool.
yeah, I mean, from a residential, obviously rainwater harvesting at a residential level is not going to put a humongous dent in things, but as water will increase in cost, you know, free water falls from the sky a couple of months a
Right.
year here in the
Well, and
desert, and if we can,
most of the water use happens outside. So,
mhm,
yeah, I think water harvesting is a really overlooked aspect, especially in the Phoenix metro area.
mhm.
You know, that could be something that could really,
It's gaining traction. More and more people are getting more interested in it, and kind of just seeing the writing on the wall here. And I think it's a
yeah.
good thing. It's a good thing. Joanna,
Yeah,
I can't.
we moved over to artificial turf a few
Yeah,
years ago, and I love it. I
nice.
love the fact that we have fake
Yep,
grass, and yeah, our water use is super low.
awesome.
Yeah,
It's beautiful. Hey, it's fun too when you get to see your water bill come in every month and go, man, it's getting smaller. I love it.
yeah, yeah. Actually, it was cool. I did a water audit. Yeah, I live in Gilbert,
Yeah.
and so you can get a water audit if people don't know about these. Like totally do it. Totally do it. It's free. All you have to do is like call up the town and be like, please audit my place,
Hmm.
and they'll come out and they will look at your water use, both indoor and outdoor.
Yeah.
They'll help you with figuring out how you should be irrigating for like what times and
Yep.
how you have all that kind of stuff. um,
Yeah. The
it's an
education programs.
underutilized thing that so many more people should do.
Yeah, Gilbert's ahead of the game. Their education programs for even outdoor irrigation systems is just awesome. Joanna, I can't
Yeah,
tell
but they
you.
have them also in Chandler
Yeah,
and
yeah,
Phoenix. So if there's
exactly,
other people that are watching and you
totally.
know, a lot of cities have this thing. So like look into it, do it. It's cool. You can really make a big difference. Even with our artificial turf,
Hmm.
we found huge amounts of water outside that we could still save and change. So yeah,
Awesome. Yeah, that's amazing.
yeah.
Joanna, I just can't tell you how perfect of a guest you are to have on here because
Yay!
you're right in the middle, and you know, you checked me a couple times even, and I love that because you've been involved in this. You don't have any vested interest in one of any of the players in a sense, and you can
Yeah.
kind of just see it for, you're very objective, and I just think it's, thank you. You're just perfect for this, and
Yay!
I would love to do this again with you
Hopefully
as,
people watch this and didn't go, you lost me at water. Like, what were you talking about?
hey, you know what? That's okay. But there'll definitely be people who can follow. And I consider myself a layman, so I think anyone listening who's a layman as well could follow along pretty well. And if you care about the community that you live in, this topic should be you know, as one of the more important topics that you should be paying attention to. I mean,
100%.
so
Yeah.
often we're just so caught up in like the federal government political shenanigans that and that's all we consume ourselves with, that, hey man, go local. This is where it's at. This is where real change can happen. I mean, it's very frustrating to try to like look for change at a federal level sometimes. But when you get
Yeah.
real investing, get into the weeds like you brought up earlier, at a local level, this is where real change can happen. And you can, even your own behaviors, it can at least chip away at that, and even just the more and more people that have knowledge about this, the sooner we will come up with a sustainable a solution, because more people talking to their politicians saying, hey, water is a big issue for me.
Yeah,
It's great.
hey, I am so excited to see that there are people that are interested, much more in the last couple of years than there was. And, we were talking about this before, we started recording, but I mean, I do think that there is a lot more interest, and there are a lot more people who are trying to figure out things. So it's good. It can only go up from here.
Yeah, awesome, awesome. If anyone wants to check out what you're doing, I mean, check out Arizona Republic. You're the digital opinions editor. Just thank you. You are what a great member of our community you are, Joanna. I really appreciate you.
Oh, thanks. Well, I'm happy to talk about water anytime. So
Wow, you
yeah.
are a wealth of knowledge. You're like a deep, deep aquifer of knowledge about water.
You
So.
know what's funny is I've only been really writing about water for like 3 years, or two, or now three. Yeah.
Well, and you know what? Maybe there's people that know way more than you even, and
Oh yeah.
maybe that's a good thing, though. Maybe
No,
we would
it's
be lost
great.
with
There are
them.
so many people out there that know a ton. It's great.
Yeah. Thank you so much for joining us.
You're
I'm
welcome.
just really excited to get this out there to people, and I hope we can get this in as many brains as possible, and get these ideas and just these concepts and the vision of what's going on here in Arizona, because what a beautiful place. And I don't think we're going to necessarily stop people from moving here, because it is so awesome. But how can we, with the growth that's coming, because it's not going to stop, how can we create these communities where it's not, where they're not here 100 years from now? God, that would be horrible. So
Yeah.
if we're going to build, and we're going to plow down the desert to build development, well, let's make sure that development's going to be here, and be producing for all living beings. Thank you, Joanna.
You're
Thank you so
welcome.
much.